Perfectionism is toxic and it will make you unhappy. And even if you don't consider yourself a perfectionist, chances are you actually measure yourself against what you believe to be perfection. So this is what Dan Sullivan would call being in the gap. When you're in the gap, you're measuring yourself against what your ideal is. And we do this in a lot of different ways. As an example, when my kids come down to the kitchen table, if it's not what they want, for example, my wife might make chicken casserole. And they're like, we wanted pizza. What they're doing is they're measuring what's on the table against what their ideal of perfection is, which in this case is pizza. Wherever you measure yourself against determines your happiness level. And most people, they measure themselves against their ideal of perfection. This is one of the reasons why social media can be so toxic. Over 90% of people use social media to compare themselves and their lives with other people. And often those comparisons are upward comparisons, meaning you're comparing yourself with people who you perceive to be above you in some way. We have a lot of what are called reference points. A reference point is basically a standard of measurement. When you're going to school, you measure yourself against other people because there's grades. You're tested on math and science and all those things. And so the reference point is given to you by the school system, and you're competing against other students on those reference points. You're measured against other students and you're competing against other students. And so as young children, we're actually taught to measure ourselves based on external reference points, which are given to us by some external authority, in this case the school system, and we're competing against other people on the same reference point. And then when you add social media to the mix, now there's all these other reference points about other people living their lives and all these, Instagram models and etc. All these people, we now have all these ideals of perfection in society, and we're measuring ourselves against these, and as a result, we're in the gap. You're in the gap whenever you measure yourself against an ideal, which is your view of what perfection is or what your view of what it should have been. And what Dan Sullivan has found, him being the co-founder of Strategic Coach being the number one entrepreneurial coaching company in the world. And by the way, he came up with the gap in the gain concept back in the early 90s. But the gap in the gain is really the idea of either you're measuring yourself against perfection or you're measuring yourself against your own progress. Being in the gain is where you measure yourself against your own progress. And by the way, that is a much healthier, mentally healthy mindset. And I'm going to explain that in a second why. But one of the things that Dan Sullivan found in coaching very high-level entrepreneurs is one of the key aspects of strategic coaches is that every 90 days they all get back together and they report their progress, and also they go through thinking tools to learn and progress and grow. Well, what Dan found is that often these entrepreneurs, it doesn't matter all the things that they accomplished over the previous 90 days, they would often be in the gap because they'd be saying, yeah, these are the things we did over the last 90 days, but we didn't do this, this, and this. We could have been here. We should have been there. And so they were devaluing their own progress because they were measuring it against their ideal or their view of what would have been a perfect 90 days. And you probably do this on a daily basis as well. Think about it like this. What if you have 5 items on your to-do list for today and you only accomplish 4? You might feel like a failure if you're measuring yourself against those 5 because you're measuring yourself against what today would have been or should have been or could have been. So perfectionism is toxic. Being in the gap is toxic. It's toxic for my kids when they get to the table to say, why didn't you make us pizza? Or why couldn't it have been something else? That's toxic. There's actually a great quote from Greg McKeown. He wrote this in his recent book called Effortless. He said, when you focus on what you lack, you lose what you have. Whereas when you focus on what you have, you gain what you lack. That's a beautiful statement. It's a pure truth. If you focus on what you lack, you lose what you have. What happens to my kids when they're measuring the meal in front of them against their ideal of perfection? They lose joy of the moment. They lose gratitude. They lose appreciation. They lose context of what they have. And actually what they have becomes immediately diminished and devalued because it's measured against perfection in their head, which is a huge lack of gratitude. It's a huge view of lack, and it diminishes what you have. And that's what Dan Sullivan was so frustrated about with his entrepreneurs, is that they would make all this progress over the last 90 days, and then they would measure that progress against their view of what perfection would have and should have been over those last 90 days. And so they've just devalued all of their progress, and they've also devalued where they're currently at because they're measuring where they're at against where they believe they should have been if they had been perfect. And that's what people do on a daily basis. They've got 10 items on their to-do list, they hit 3 of them or 4 of them, and then they devalue today. They say, today was a failure because I didn't get that perfect grade. Perfectionism is fundamentally toxic. You're a perfectionist if you measure yourself against your ideals. And by the way, ideals, by definition, are unreachable. They're like a horizon in the desert, as Dan would say. You can never actually reach the horizon. It simply provides illumination for which direction you should go. You can have ideals, but you don't measure yourself against them. So instead of measuring yourself against perfection or against what perfect would have been or could have been or should have been. And by the way, trauma, in large part, and emotional trauma comes because you're measuring what occurred against what should have happened. Let's just say you get in a car accident and lose your legs. That's trauma. But it's only trauma if you measure it against what should have happened, or if you're measuring your life against other people. Why didn't someone else get in a car accident? I'm not telling you to not be devastated by something horrible that happens. We all have horrible experiences that happen. I have horrible experiences that happen to me. But when you're measuring yourself in the gain rather than the gap, when you actually look at this as a gain, and how can you turn this into a gain? Post-traumatic growth occurs when you actually look at an event, you look at an experience, and you find ways to have more meaning and purpose as a result. You know you've experienced post-traumatic growth because, number one, you value the experience. You find value in having gone through that car accident. Yeah, it was terrible, but you can still find value in it. Even in the challenges that came as a result, you can find value in those. You can find learning, growth. And so you know post-traumatic growth has occurred because you find value in the experience, you're grateful for the experience, and you now feel better off in various ways because of the experience. You feel better off. You feel like you've gained through that experience. That's post-traumatic growth. Trauma is when you have an event that occurs, you devalue that experience by saying, why did this happen to me? This shouldn't have happened. This was a worthless experience. So you devalue the experience. You also avoid thinking about it. And you fundamentally feel that you're worse off now because it happened. You've gone backwards, or you're now incapable because the event happened. You're worse off because the event happened. That's trauma. It's all how you contextualize the experience. You contextualize something against perfection, against what could have been, what should have been, which would make you a perfectionist, which is toxic, which creates trauma after trauma after trauma. Even success becomes traumatic, by the way, if you're in the gap. Let me explain. For a long time, I wanted to be an author. Probably in 2009, I decided I wanted to be an author. I was serving a church mission. I came home from that mission, started going to school, got into a PhD program, and eventually I started blogging online and my blog started taking off. This was like by 2015, my blog started taking off. In 2017, I finally get my first major book deal. I get a great book deal. And then I write a book that ends up becoming called Willpower Doesn't Work. It comes out in 2018. By various measures, it's a great success. But I was wanting to hit the New York Times bestseller list. And because that book didn't hit the New York Times bestseller list, I felt like a failure. After achieving a major goal, a major dream, which I'd been going for almost 10 years, and by doing something that, by all accounts, and this is not to measure myself against other people, but less than 1% of writers ever get a book deal, let alone a book deal at the level I got. And I was never measuring my own progress. I was only measuring myself in that moment against what I thought it should have been, which was a New York Times bestseller. I devalued my success. I devalued all that progress over those 9 years. And so I felt like a failure, and it was only because of how I framed it. It was only because I was measuring it against the ideal rather than measuring against my progress. So that's what Dan Sullivan's Gap and the Gain is all about. And by the way, The Gap and the Gain is a book I wrote with Dan Sullivan, which comes out in October. You can Google it. There's a link down below. Please get that book. It will change your life. So you can either measure yourself against perfection, which makes you a failure no matter what you do. It makes every experience into a failure. It devalues every moment because you're focusing on what you lack. Or you can measure yourself against only one thing, your own progress. That's where, rather than having external reference points, you actually develop an internal reference point. There's a great quote from Ernest Hemingway. He said, "There's nothing noble about being superior to your fellow man. True nobility is about being superior to your former self." That's it. It doesn't matter who you're competing against. The only person you should be better than is your former self. And if you're making progress every day, then you're better than who you were yesterday. And you are better. Even if things didn't go the way you wanted to yesterday, you're still further than you were yesterday. You can get progress out of yesterday, even if it didn't go as planned. You can learn something that taught you something you didn't know yesterday. You can always be further along than your former self. Who are you compared to where you were 3 months ago? Where are you compared to where you were a year ago? I love the quote from Alain de Botton. He said, "If you're not embarrassed by who you were 12 months ago, you didn't learn enough." Now, there's no point in being embarrassed by who you were 12 months ago because your former self was more ignorant than you. Your former self didn't know what you know because you've now gone through experiences, learning, and growth that your former self didn't have. So there's no reason to devalue your former self, but that's the only person you should be measuring yourself against. That's when you have an internal referencing system. And once you start measuring yourself only against yourself, then you can start taking ownership over your own progress rather than putting yourself in the gap continually. Instead, you can be in the gain. And when you're in the gain, you're immediately happy. You're also immediately confident because you're living your own life. You're running your own race. And so that is really a profound mindset. Either you're measuring yourself against perfection or you're measuring yourself against your own progress, not against anyone else's progress. Who cares about anyone else's progress? You can celebrate other people's gains, and I recommend that. Actually, one of the worst things you can do is measure other people against your view of perfection for them. This is what parents do all the time. I actually have 3 kids we adopted from the foster system. We also have 3 other kids. We have 6 kids. They're all amazing. And my oldest son, he's 13. He plays tennis like 4 or 5 times a week. He is amazing. I'm so proud and impressed by him. But a year ago when he first started, I was much more in the gap about him. I would always see where he was missing the shots or see where he wasn't playing up to maybe where I thought he could be playing. And so I would always point out his flaws. And then I started learning about the gap and the gain and about helping him rather than measuring him against my ideals, which, by the way, my ideals change all the time. It doesn't matter how far my son has come over the last several years. I'm always measuring him against where I think he should be. That's toxic. It is fundamentally toxic for a parent, a teacher, a coach to constantly be measuring a child or a student against perfection. Instead, you help them measure themselves against their own progress. And that's actually, once I started learning that and applying it and helping my son measure himself, not against anyone else or not against what he should have done in that match, but against where he was last week or where he was last month. All of a sudden, he started measuring his own progress and starting to see his own progress, and that built his confidence, and it also built his joy in tennis. He was no longer worried about winning or losing. He was worried about learning. And that's actually a key aspect of having a growth mindset. When you have a growth mindset, you're just focused on learning and improving, whereas if you have a fixed mindset, you're focused on proving yourself, proving your worth, proving your value to other people. A fixed mindset is a perfectionistic mindset. It's a flawed mindset. It's a toxic mindset. And once I started helping my son see his own progress and measuring his own progress, rather than measuring himself against my ideals, his own ideals, or against other tennis players, his growth accelerated like crazy. His joy, his confidence accelerated. So those are the 2 ways in which you can measure yourself, against perfection or against your own progress. One is where you're in the gap. It makes you chronically unhappy. One is where you're in the gain, which makes you joyful, confident. It allows you to run your own race, to stop worrying about what other people think about you. I am only measuring my own progress. My progress has nothing to do with you. Your view of my progress has nothing to do with me. You see the world from your own view, and if you're measuring me against yourself, that puts you in the gap. I'm not doing that to you, and I don't really care what your measurement of me is. The only person whose judgment of me and my own progress that matters is me. And the same is true of you. The only person whose judgment of your progress that matters is you. And you get to decide what your progress means. You get to focus on your own progress. And then from there, you can develop intrinsic motivation to set your own meaningful targets without respect or worry about what other people think about those. So that's the gap. That's the gain. It's a Dan Sullivan concept. The book comes out in October. Please get it. Please read it. Please have your mind changed. Please help yourself be in the gain more, and please help other people be in the gain more. Please like this video if you enjoyed it, and take some time to measure your own gains. Look at where you were 6 months ago, and just write down a list of all of your progress, all of the positive experiences you've had, all the things you've learned over the last 6 months. You can do it over the last 6 years if you want, over the last 10 years. You can even do it over today. There are 2 ways to measure yourself, against perfection or against your own progress. There's only one person to measure yourself against, and that's your former self, where you were before. That's it. Have a beautiful day.